On the 16th of May, 1811, Marshal Soult looked across the battlefield near the Spanish village of Albuera and believed he had found the way to break the Allied army. His infantry had not simply attacked the front, they had turned towards the exposed flank. His guns were tearing into the line. His cavalry waited for the moment when British infantry would make one mistake. Then the mistake came. A storm of rain and hail swept across the field. Smoke dropped over the slope. Colonel John Colborne's brigade was caught while changing position, and Polish lancers and French hussars struck its open flank before the men could properly form square. In minutes, 3 British battalions were almost destroyed. Colours were taken. Men were ridden down. A brigade that had marched forward to save the battle was cut to pieces almost before it understood what had happened. Soult thought the day was his. But the British line did not run. Behind the wreck of Colborne's brigade, more redcoats moved into the smoke. The 29th, the 48th, and the 57th stood under one of the most punishing infantry fights of the Peninsular War. The 57th would earn a name there that followed it for generations, the diehards. Then the Fusilier Brigade came forward, stepping into a battlefield already covered with dead and wounded, and drove into the French line when the whole Allied army seemed close to collapse. So how did a British line that had already been broken in front survive one of the bloodiest battles of the war against Napoleon? The road to Albuera began with Badajoz. In 1811, the fortress mattered because it guarded one of the key routes between Portugal and Spain. Whoever held Badajoz could threaten invasion, protect movement, and influence the whole southern theatre of the Peninsular War. For Wellington, Badajoz had to be taken. For Napoleon's marshals, it had to be protected. Wellington was not at Albuera. That matters. The Allied army facing Soult was commanded by Marshal William Carr Beresford, a British officer serving as Marshal of the Portuguese army. Beresford had qualities. He had worked hard to rebuild the Portuguese forces, and he understood discipline. But Albuera would show that he was not Wellington on a battlefield. He would face one of Napoleon's most experienced commanders in a fight where minutes mattered, and where a wrong reading of the ground could cost thousands of men. Soult had marched to relieve Badajoz. He knew Beresford's army was waiting near Albuera, but he also believed he could outmaneuver it. The village stood near the Albuera stream, with a bridge and a road that seemed to invite a direct attack. Beresford expected the French to come there. Soult gave him exactly enough reason to keep believing it. On the morning of the battle, the French opened with a feint towards the village. General Godinot's troops pressed in that direction, and fighting began around the bridge and the houses. German troops in Allied service, Portuguese guns, and other defenders held the approach. To Beresford, it looked as if the main blow might fall where he expected it. But Soult's real attack was moving elsewhere. French columns under Girard and Gazan were shifting towards the Allied right, where Spanish troops under General Blake held ground that was not as securely arranged as it needed to be. Soult wanted to turn the flank, roll up the army, and cut Beresford away from the road to Badajoz. If he succeeded, the Allied siege would collapse, and Albuera would become a French victory built on deception. The first men to receive the real weight of the attack was Spanish. This is important because Albuera is often remembered for British endurance, but the battle would not have lasted long enough for that endurance to matter if the Spanish line had simply disappeared. General Zayas's troops stood against the French advance with discipline and courage. They faced pressure from infantry and artillery, and they held longer than Soult expected. Their resistance bought time, but time was exactly what Beresford was already losing. Beresford had been slow to see the full danger. When he did, he had to shift troops quickly to the threatened flank. Major General William Stewart's 2nd Division was ordered forward. Stewart was aggressive. brave, and far too eager to strike. Instead of carefully placing his brigades under the conditions in front of him, he pushed Colborne's brigade into action in a way that exposed it to cavalry at the worst possible moment. Colborne's brigade included the 3rd Foot, known as the Buffs, the 31st, the 48th, and the 66th. These were not raw men walking into their first alarm. They were British infantry in a war where discipline under fire had already become a mark of survival. They advanced against the French left, and for a moment their fire seemed to be doing its work. The French line faltered under the pressure. A British bayonet charge appeared possible. The battle seemed to be turning back in Beresford's favour. Then the weather changed. Rain and hail swept across the field. Visibility collapsed. Muskets became harder to use. The smoke and storm hid movement at exactly the wrong time. La Tour-Maubourg's cavalry saw the opportunity. The 1st Vistula Lancers and French hussars struck Colborne's exposed flank before the brigade could protect itself. Infantry in line is deadly against infantry in front of it. Against cavalry hitting an open flank, it can become helpless in seconds. The Lancers came in fast. Men tried to turn, officers shouted orders, some attempted to form square, but confusion, ground, weather and timing were against them. The 31st managed to form and avoid the worst of the disaster. The other battalions were overwhelmed. The Buffs, the 48th and the 66th, were ridden through, stabbed, cut down, captured, scattered. Regimental colours were seized in the chaos. Soldiers who had been firing into French infantry moments earlier were now fighting horsemen among their own files. This was not a setback, it was a battlefield catastrophe. Before the British line begins its fight for survival, write in the comments where you are watching from. Albuera was fought in Spain, but its story belongs to every viewer who wants to understand what happens when an army is almost beaten, and ordinary soldiers still have to decide whether they will stand or run. When Colborne's brigade was shattered, Soult had reason to believe the Allied army was close to breaking. The French attack had turned the flank. British infantry had been mauled by cavalry. Spanish troops had already been under heavy pressure. Beresford's handling of the battle looked uncertain. For a commander like Soult, this was the kind of moment a battle is supposed to obey. Press harder, widen the rupture, turn pressure into panic. But the Allied army did not collapse. The reason was not one heroic gesture. It was a sequence of brutal stands. The Spanish continued to resist. Portuguese troops held their parts of the field. British reinforcements moved into the killing ground, and Stuart's remaining brigades, especially Houghton's, were thrown into a fight that would become infamous even among soldiers used to the violence of the Peninsular War. Brigadier Daniel Houghton's brigade included the 29th, the 1st Battalion of the 48th, and the 57th. They advanced into a storm of fire against French infantry that had not yet been broken. This was not a clean line calmly firing at a distant enemy. The air was thick with smoke. The ground was slippery. Dead and wounded from earlier fighting lay around the slope. Guns fired into crowded formations. Officers tried to keep alignment while men fell in rows. The 57th took position in the line and stayed there under punishment that would have broken many regiments. Their colonel, William Inglis, was wounded, but tradition says he urged his men to die hard. Whether every word was recorded exactly as later memory preserved it, the name remained because the regiment's conduct made it believable. They did not dissolve. They did not drift away from the fire. They held under a level of loss that turned a regimental nickname into a legend. The fighting became a musketry duel at close range. French columns and lines pressed hard. British battalions answered with volleys. The smoke grew so thick that men could sometimes see only flashes through it. A soldier might fire at the glow of muskets, rather than a clean target. The sound was constant: rolling volleys, artillery, drums, shouted commands, wounded men calling for help, officers trying to make themselves heard over the collapse of order. Houghton was killed. His brigade suffered terribly. The 29th and 48th stood in the same furnace. The 57th bled into the slope but remained in line. This was the moment where Soult's reported judgment would later become famous, that the British were beaten but did not know it and would not run. The phrase survives because it captures the strange horror of Albuera. From a commander's distance, the British line should have been finished. On the ground, the men inside it were still loading, firing and stepping over the fallen. Beresford's army was now in a terrible position. The French were not destroyed. The British brigades already engaged had suffered enormous losses. Colborne's brigade was wrecked. Houghton's brigade was being consumed. The Spanish had held longer than expected, but their line could not be asked to do everything forever. If nothing changed, Soult might still turn stubborn resistance into defeat by simply feeding more troops into the pressure. Then came the Fusilier Brigade. Lieutenant Colonel Sir William Myers commanded the brigade, composed of battalions of the 7th Foot, the Royal Fusiliers, and the 23rd Foot, the Royal Welch Fusiliers. They moved forward into a battle that must have looked less like a field and more like the aftermath of a massacre that had not yet ended. The slope ahead was filled with smoke, bodies, broken formations and flags. The enemy was still there, still dangerous, still capable of turning the day. The Fusiliers did not arrive as spectators to a victory. They arrived because victory was slipping away. There is a particular kind of courage required to advance into a fight you can already see is devouring the men in front of you. It is different from marching at the start of a battle, when formations are clean and hope is still abstract. The Fusiliers could see what had happened to Colborne's men. They could see Houghton's brigade under savage fire. They could understand that if they failed, there might not be another fresh British line behind them strong enough to repair the battle. They went forward anyway. Their fire struck the French at a critical moment. The French infantry had been fighting hard, but they too had suffered heavily. Their formations had been under Spanish fire, then British fire, then continuous pressure as the battle lengthened. When the Fusilier Brigade advanced and delivered its volleys, it added weight at the exact point where French momentum was no longer fresh. The Fusiliers moved through smoke and confusion, but they brought a new shock into a French line that had expected the enemy to be nearly spent. Then they charged. This was not a parade ground advance. It was a push through the wreckage of a battle where the dead of both sides marked every yard. Myers was killed. Other officers fell. The brigade paid for every step, but the attack helped tip the balance. French resistance began to give way. The pressure that had almost destroyed Beresford's army started to reverse. The Allied line, which had spent the middle of the battle simply refusing to die, now began to move forward. If you enjoy stories where history turns not on a perfect plan, but on soldiers holding a line when the plan has almost failed, subscribe to the channel. And write in the comments where you are watching from, because Albuera was not a clean victory. It was a battle where men stood so long under fire that survival itself became the turning point. Soult now faced the truth that his opportunity had passed. He had outmaneuvered Beresford. He had struck the flank. His cavalry had destroyed much of a British brigade. His infantry had fought one of the hardest actions of the campaign, but he had not broken the Allied army. The Spanish had stood. The Portuguese had held. The British infantry, even after being punished almost beyond belief, had refused to run. The French began to withdraw, not in a wild rout, not as a shattered mob, but as an army that had inflicted terrible damage and could no longer finish the job. Soult had come to relieve Badajoz by beating Beresford in the field. He left the battlefield without the decisive victory he needed. The price was dreadful. Albuera became one of the bloodiest battles of the Peninsular War. Exact figures vary between accounts, but both armies lost thousands. Some British battalions suffered losses so severe that the numbers almost stopped meaning anything. Colborne's brigade was devastated. The 57th's losses helped create the legend of the diehards. The Fusiliers had advanced into the last crisis and paid heavily for their part in ending it. Even victory felt too damaged to celebrate. The battlefield itself told the story better than any dispatch. Around the slope where the infantry had fought, the ground was covered with men who had stood close enough to kill each other by musket fire, bayonet, and cavalry attack. Colours had been lost and defended. Commanders had fallen. Regiments had been reduced to shadows of their morning strength. The army had survived, but it had survived like a man pulled from under a collapsed wall, alive, but barely. Albuera also left an uncomfortable question about command. Beresford had won, but his conduct was criticized. Soult had lost the chance for victory, but his maneuver had been dangerous and intelligent. Stuart's eagerness had contributed to the disaster that destroyed Colborne's brigade. The line held not because every senior decision was brilliant, but because enough formations at the lower level endured the consequences of mistakes made above them. That makes the battle more powerful. It is easy to turn history into stories where commanders move units like pieces on a board and victory follows from design. Albuera is different. It shows that a good enemy can outthink you. It shows that weather can ruin timing. It shows that cavalry can erase infantry if the moment is right. It shows that an army can be saved by men who were never meant to carry the whole weight of the battle, but suddenly find that no one else can. The British heroism at Albuera was not invincibility. It was endurance after shock. Colborne's men were not saved by myth. Many were cut down or captured. Houghton's brigade was not protected by glory. It was torn apart in the musketry. The 57th did not become the diehards because war was romantic. They earned the name because they remained in position under punishment that made withdrawal feel natural. The Fusiliers did not advance into a clean triumph. They advanced because the day was still in danger. And the French were not weak. Soult's army was experienced, well-led, and dangerous. The cavalry strike against Colborne was one of the most devastating moments of the battle. The infantry under Girard and Gazan fought fiercely. French pressure nearly succeeded. That is exactly why the British stand matters. A weak enemy does not create a legend. Albuera became unforgettable because the opponent was strong enough to almost win. The battle did not end the Peninsular War. It did not capture Badajoz that day. It did not destroy Soult's army. In strategic terms, the result was complicated, and the wider campaign would continue with more sieges, marches, and bloodshed. But Albuera did something that matters in military memory. It revealed the cost of holding a line when everything around that line is going wrong. There are battles remembered for maneuver. There are battles remembered for a single charge. Albuera is remembered for stubbornness, for smoke, rain, lancers, musketry, and men who seemed beaten from the outside but kept firing from within the wreckage. By the end of the day, the Allied army still held the field. Soult had failed to break it. Beresford had survived a battle that might have ruined him. The Spanish had proved their steadiness in one of the hardest moments of the war. The Portuguese had stood with the Allies, and the British infantry had written one of the harshest chapters in its Napoleonic record. The line at Albuera did not refuse to die because the men in it were untouched by fear. They were afraid, exhausted, wounded, deafened and half-blinded by smoke. They refused to die because the alternative was worse. If they gave way, the army might collapse, Badajoz might be relieved, and Soult's army would turn a bloody chance into a French success. So they stayed. When Colborne's brigade was shattered, others stepped forward. When Houghton fell, his men kept fighting. When the 57th was torn open, it remained in the line. When the Fusiliers were needed, they advanced through a field already marked by disaster. That is the real story of Albuera. Not that Britain could not be hurt. It was hurt terribly. Not that the plan was flawless. It was not. Not that victory was clean. It was soaked in loss. The story is that on the 16th of May, 1811, near a small Spanish village, Marshal Soult came closer than he knew to breaking the Allied army. He had the flank. He had the cavalry strike. He had the smoke, the storm, and the moment. But the British line would not run, and because it would not run, the battle Soult almost won became the victory Britain barely survived. If this story changed the way you see the Peninsular War, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which battle, commander or regiment before 1900 we should break down next.